2024, more than 1,300 people died during the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca. The official Saudi figure, released weeks after the event, was 1,301. Independent researchers who collected data from national health ministries across the countries whose citizens had traveled to Mecca, Egypt, Jordan, Indonesia, Pakistan, Iran, Senegal, Tunisia, Morocco, assembled a separate count that reached 1,301 before several governments had finished reporting. The final number, when all countries had submitted their data, was higher. Estimates from public health researchers range between 1,600 and 2,000. The deaths occurred over 5 days in late May and early June 2024 during the Hajj, the annual Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca that is one of the 5 pillars of the faith, and that every Muslim who is physically and financially able is required to perform at least once in their lifetime. Approximately 1.8 million pilgrims had traveled to Saudi Arabia for the 2024 Hajj from every country on earth. They came from Indonesia and Nigeria and Pakistan and Egypt and the United States and Bosnia and China and Bangladesh and 100 other places. They came because their faith required it and because for many of them this was a journey of a lifetime, saved for over decades, prayed toward, the fulfillment of an obligation that defined how they understood themselves in relation to God. They came in June. June in Mecca is 48 degrees Celsius. Mecca sits in a valley in the Hijaz Mountains of western Saudi Arabia. The geography is specific, and it matters. The valley traps heat. The mountains that surround the city on 3 sides block the winds that might otherwise provide some relief. The city itself, a dense urban environment of towers and hotels, and the grand mosque complex built around the Kaaba, generates additional heat through the urban heat island effect. The marble and stone and concrete of the holy sites absorb heat during the day and release it at night, meaning the temperature at ground level in the areas where pilgrims walk and pray and perform the rituals of the Hajj does not follow the normal diurnal pattern of rising by day and falling by night. It stays high. On June 17, 2024, the peak day of the Hajj, the day of Arafat when all pilgrims must gather on a plain outside Mecca and stand together in prayer, the temperature reached 51.8 degrees Celsius, 125 degrees Fahrenheit. There is no shade on the plain of Arafat. There is the sky and the ground, and 1.8 million people standing between them. The first person in this story is a 66-year-old Egyptian schoolteacher named Hassan. He had been saving for the Hajj for 22 years. He was a secondary school Arabic teacher from a town in the Nile Delta, the son of a farmer, the father of 3 daughters, a man whose life had been organized around the routines of the school year and the rhythms of a modest provincial Egyptian life. He had applied for the Hajj quota. Egypt allocates a fixed number of permits each year based on the Saudi quota system, and demand vastly exceeds supply. For times before his name was drawn. When it was drawn in late 2023, he told his wife that night that he felt it was meant to be this year. He arrived in Mecca on June 12, 2024, with a group of approximately 400 Egyptian pilgrims organized through a licensed travel operator. The group was assigned accommodation in the Azazia district, approximately 4 kilometers from the Grand Mosque. The accommodation was adequate. Air-conditioned rooms shared between 4 pilgrims, meals provided, transportation by bus to the holy sites. What the travel operator had not adequately communicated, or what Hassan had not fully processed in the reverence and anticipation of finally arriving, was the practical reality of what the Hajj required physically. The pilgrimage involved specific rituals performed at specific times in specific locations, and the movement between those locations, on foot in the heat, carrying the weight of the ihram garments and personal items, in a crowd of 1.8 million people, is not optional. The rituals cannot be performed from an air-conditioned room. They require the body to be present in the heat. On June 15, Hassan walked approximately 11 kilometers on foot between ritual sites. The temperature was 47 degrees. He drank regularly from the water bottles his group had been given. He used a cooling spray that several of the younger members of the group carried. Small aerosol cans of water that provide brief evaporative cooling on the skin. He rested when he could find shade, which was not often. By evening, he was exhausted in a way that felt different from ordinary exhaustion. His legs ached in a deep way. He told one of the younger men in his group that he felt very tired, and the young man told him everyone felt very tired, and this was normal, and Hassan agreed that it was probably normal. He was 66 years old. He had a mild heart condition that his doctor in Egypt had assessed as stable and manageable. His doctor had told him he could make the Hajj. His doctor had not been to Mecca in June. On June 16th, Hassan woke at 4 a.m. for far prayer and felt the heaviness still in his legs and a new heaviness behind his eyes. He prayed. He ate. He got on the bus with his group for the journey to Arafat. The plain of Arafat is approximately 20 square kilometers of flat open ground 12 kilometers east of Mecca. On the day of Arafat, the 9th of Dhul Hijjah in the Islamic calendar, which fell on June 15th in 2024, every pilgrim performing the Hajj must be present on this plain from noon until sunset. The standing on Arafat is the central ritual of the entire pilgrimage. It is the moment that, in Islamic theology, most closely approximates a gathering of all humanity before God on the Day of Judgment. Missing it invalidates the Hajj entirely. There is no substitution, no alternative, no dispensation for weather conditions. You stand on Arafat, or you have not performed the Hajj. The Saudi authorities provide large white tents on the plain. The tents have air conditioning. There are approximately enough tents for the pilgrims who have paid for organized packages through licensed operators. The official pilgrims, the ones with permits and registered accommodations and transportation. There are also, every year, a significant number of pilgrims who come to Mecca without official permits. They come because they cannot afford the permit process, or because the quota for their country was exhausted, or because they found unofficial routes through travel agents operating outside the regulated system. In 2024, Egyptian authorities estimated that approximately 300,000 Egyptian pilgrims were in Mecca without valid permits. People would travel to Saudi Arabia on other visas and made their way to Mecca to perform the pilgrimage they had saved for and prayed for outside the official system that would have entitled them to the tents and the buses and the organized shade structures. These pilgrims walked. They stood on Arafat in the open sun. They had no tents, no official water distribution, no cooling stations assigned to them. They moved through the city and between the ritual sites on foot through 48-degree streets with whatever water they had carried. The majority of the people who died in the 2024 Hajj were from this group. Hassan was not in this group. He had a valid permit. He had a tent on Arafat. He was sitting inside the tent, in the air conditioning, when the heaviness behind his eyes became a pressure, and the pressure became a pain, and the pain became something else, a confusion, a difficulty understanding what the man beside him was saying, a sense that the tent was not quite where it had been a moment ago. He did not tell anyone immediately. This is consistent with what researchers have documented about heat illness in elderly pilgrims. The impaired judgment that comes with elevated core temperature manifests as a reluctance to acknowledge symptoms, a tendency to interpret deterioration as normal fatigue, a desire not to interrupt the spiritual experience with physical complaint. The man beside him noticed 20 minutes later that Hassan was not responding normally to conversation. He called for help. The Hajj medical system, run by the Saudi Ministry of Health with support from international teams, deployed approximately 25,000 medical personnel for the 2024 pilgrimage. Field hospitals, ambulances, roving medical teams. The system is large and has been built up over decades of experience with heat emergencies during the Hajj. It is also serving 1.8 million people in 5 days in 51-degree heat, and in June 2024 was overwhelmed in ways that its scale had not prevented. The response team reached Hassan in 11 minutes. His core temperature was 40.4 degrees. They began cooling immediately. Ice packs for fluids moved him to the field hospital. He survived. His heart, the mild condition his doctor had assessed as stable, required monitoring for 4 days after the event. He was discharged from a Saudi hospital and flew home to Egypt 11 days after he had arrived. He told his daughters, when he returned, that he had performed the Hajj. He did not describe in detail what had happened on Arafat. He said it was the most important thing he had ever done. He said he would not do it again. The Egyptian pilgrims without permits did not have tents on Arafat. They had the sky. Egyptian health authorities, piecing together what happened in the weeks after the Hajj, interviewed survivors and family members and medical personnel who had been present. The picture that emerged was consistent and specific. Groups of Egyptian pilgrims who had traveled to Saudi Arabia on Umrah visas, the visa for the lesser pilgrimage, which can be performed at any time of year and which does not require a quota permit, had remained in the country past their visa validity and made their way to Mecca for the Hajj. They had paid unofficial travel agents between 3,000 and 8,000 Egyptian pounds, between 60 and 165 US dollars at the exchange rate at the time, for arrangements that included transport to the holy sites but not the regulated accommodations and official tent assignments that the permit system provided. What they got for that money was access to the ritual sites. What they did not get was shade, organized water distribution, cooling stations, medical teams assigned to their groups, or transportation between sites during the hottest hours of the day. They walked, in 48-degree heat, between sites that were kilometers apart, along roads and paths that were not designed for pedestrian movement at this scale and these temperatures. The official pilgrim routes have shade structures, misting systems, water stations at regular intervals. The unofficial routes, used by pilgrims outside the permit system, had none of these things because they were not supposed to be used. A survivor named Fatma, 58 years old from the Minya Governorate in Upper Egypt, described walking for 6 hours on June 15th between ritual sites with a group of approximately 40 women, most of them between 50 and 70 years old. They had 2 water bottles each when they started. The water ran out after 2 hours. The misting stations they passed were designated for permit holders, and the attendants directed them away. They found a tap, a municipal water connection on the side of a building, and drank from it and filled their bottles. The water was not cold. It was warm from the pipe, but it was water. Several of the women in Fatma's group began struggling by the 3rd hour. One woman, 63 years old from Asiat, stopped walking and sat on the ground and said she could not continue. 2 others sat beside her. Fatma and 3 other women stayed with them while the rest of the group continued. They sat in what shade existed, a sliver cast by a building at a certain angle of the afternoon sun, and waited. Fatma poured water on the woman's neck and face. She fanned her with a piece of cardboard she had been carrying. She called out to passers-by for help. A Saudi volunteer, a young man who was part of an informal network of local residents who come to Mecca during the Hajj specifically to assist pilgrims in distress, found them after approximately 40 minutes. He had water and a phone. He called the emergency medical line. He stayed until the responders arrived. The woman from Asiat was taken to a field hospital. She survived. She was one of the ones who survived. The field hospitals during the 2024 Hajj were operating beyond their design capacity by June 15th. The Saudi Ministry of Health had deployed 25,000 medical personnel, 5,000 ambulances, 147 hospitals and health centers across the Mecca and Mina regions. These numbers sound large. They are large. They are also the numbers required to serve 1.8 million people in extreme heat over 5 days, and the margin between adequate and inadequate at that scale is narrow enough that a hotter-than-average year, and 2024 was significantly hotter than the previous year's Hajj, can close entirely. The field hospital in Mina, the district east of Mecca, where pilgrims spend several days during the Hajj performing the ritual stoning of the devil at the Jamarat, received 340 heat-stroke patients on June 15th alone. Its designed daily capacity for all conditions was 200. The medical director, a Saudi physician who gave an anonymous interview to a Lebanese newspaper after the Hajj, described the afternoon of June 15th as unlike anything in 15 years of Hajj medicine. He said they were performing triage in the ambulance bays because there was no room inside. He said they were using ice from a catering supply, the food service ice, not medical ice, because the medical cooling supplies had run out. He said the ambulance dispatchers were prioritizing calls by the reported condition of the patient over the phone, which meant that patients who had lost consciousness were prioritized over patients who were still responsive, which meant that some responsive patients deteriorated to unconsciousness while waiting. He said he did not know, while it was happening, how many people were dying. He found out afterward, the way everyone found out afterward. The geography of who died reveals a pattern that the aggregate number obscures. Egypt lost between 672 and 750 of its citizens. The figures vary by source and by the timing of the count. The Egyptian government's official figure, released in late June, was 672. Independent tallies from Egyptian media and NGOs tracking repatriated bodies reached higher numbers. Whatever precise figure, Egypt lost more citizens in the 2024 Hajj than any other country by a significant margin. The reason is a permit gap. Egypt has the largest Muslim population of any Arab country, approximately 95 million people, a Hajj quota that allows approximately 179,000 Egyptians to perform the pilgrimage each year. The demand for permits vastly exceeds this quota. Millions of Egyptians who wish to perform a Hajj cannot obtain permits through the official system and turn to unofficial routes. The tourist visa pathway, the informal travel agents, the arrangements that place them in Mecca outside the infrastructure designed to keep them alive in the heat. Indonesia, which has the largest Muslim population in the world, 230 million, lost approximately 200 citizens. The Indonesian Hajj system is heavily regulated, with a government-run operation that manages transport, accommodation, medical care, and supervision. Indonesian pilgrims tend to be within the official permit system. The death rate among Indonesian pilgrims was lower per capita than among Egyptian pilgrims, not because Indonesians are more physically resilient, but because they were inside the shade structures and the water distribution points and the medical surveillance systems that the permit structure provided. Jordan lost 98 citizens. Senegal lost 58. Tunisia lost 49. Iran lost 11. Iran has a highly organized state Hajj operation that manages its pilgrims closely. The pattern is consistent. Countries with well-organized state Hajj systems, where pilgrims move through the official permit structure with organized medical oversight, lost fewer people per capita. Countries where large numbers of citizens travel through unofficial channels lost more. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct relationship between access to shade, water, and medical care and survival in 51-degree heat. The question of why so many pilgrims travel through unofficial channels is not complicated, but it requires saying directly, the official Hajj is expensive. The Saudi government charges fees for the permit in the regulated packages, accommodation, transportation, 10 assignments, meals, that bring the total cost of an officially organized Hajj to between $3,000 and $8,000 depending on the country of origin and the package level. For a schoolteacher in Egypt, or a farmer in Senegal, or a factory worker in Bangladesh, this is not money that exists. It is money that must be saved for years or decades, borrowed from family, obtained through credit that will take years to repay. The unofficial route costs less, significantly less in some cases. The unofficial route also provides significantly less protection in 51-degree heat. The pilgrims who take the unofficial route are not making an irrational choice. They are making a choice constrained by what they have. The Hajj is an obligation of their faith. They have waited for it for years. They have the money for the unofficial route, but not the official route. They go, the heat does not distinguish between official and unofficial pilgrims. There is a second structural element that made the 2024 Hajj particularly deadly, and that has nothing to do with permits or poverty. The Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar. It is approximately 11 days shorter than the Gregorian solar calendar. This means that the Hajj, which falls on fixed dates in the Islamic calendar, moves backward to the Gregorian calendar by approximately 11 days each year. Over the course of a 33-year cycle, the Hajj passes through every season. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the Hajj fell in winter months, December, January, February. The temperatures in Mecca in winter are in the mid-20s. The heat deaths were dramatically lower. The pilgrimage, physically, was manageable for elderly and infirm pilgrims in ways that the summer Hajj is not. Since approximately 2012, the Hajj has been falling in summer months. It will continue to fall in summer months, increasingly hot summer months as global temperatures rise, until approximately 2040, when the cycle will begin moving the pilgrimage back towards spring and eventually winter. The years between 2012 and 2040 are the years when Hajj coincides with the hottest part of the year in one of the hottest cities on Earth. Every year in this window is a year where the combination of faith, geography, and climate produces conditions that human planning struggles to manage at the scale required. The Saudi authorities know this. They have invested billions of dollars in cooling infrastructure, misting systems along the walking routes, air-conditioned tents, cool marble surfaces at the Grand Mosque that keep the ground temperature manageable for barefoot circumambulation. They have the largest Hajj medical system in the history of the pilgrimage. They have been improving it every year. In June 2024, it was not enough. It was not enough because 51.8 degrees in an open plain with 1.8 million people is a problem that infrastructure can mitigate but cannot solve. The body standing on a plain of Arafat in direct sun at 51 degrees is subject to a heat load that exceeds what air conditioning in a tent, access for part of the day, can fully compensate for. The cumulative heat stress of 5 days of rituals, walking, standing, moving through the city, and sustained extreme heat depletes physiological reserves in ways that the breaks in air conditioning partially but not completely restore. The pilgrims who died were not failed by the absence of any effort to protect them. They were failed by the combination of a heat that was beyond what any human system, at the scale required, has yet demonstrated the ability to fully manage. After June 2024, Saudi Arabia announced new measures. The announcement came in August, 2 months after the deaths had been counted and the diplomatic pressure from Egypt and other affected countries had reached a level that required a public response. The measures included expanded cooling infrastructure along the walking routes, increased water distribution points, enhanced medical surveillance for elderly pilgrims, and, most significantly, a stated intention to enforce a permit system more strictly to reduce the number of unofficial pilgrims who move through Mecca without access to the official support infrastructure. The enforcement measure is the one that generated the most discussion because it addresses the most direct cause of the disproportionate death toll among Egyptian and other unofficial pilgrims. It is also the measure most likely to be implemented incompletely, because enforcing it fully would mean preventing hundreds of thousands of Muslims from performing an obligation of their faith, which is a decision with theological, political, and diplomatic dimensions that the Saudi government, which derives significant religious legitimacy from its role as custodian of the holy sites, is structurally disinclined to make absolutely. The Saudi government did not prevent unofficial pilgrims from entering Mecca in 2024. It will face the same choice in 2025 and in 2026, and in every year until the calendar cycle moves the Hajj out of the summer months in approximately 2040. What it does with that choice will determine, in large part, how many people die in each of those years. The Egyptian government's response was different in character. Egypt prosecuted travel agents who had facilitated unofficial Hajj travel. Several were arrested. The prosecutions were real, not performative, and reflected genuine governmental anger at the scale of Egyptian deaths and the political pressure that 672 families receiving a body instead of returning pilgrim generates in a country of 95 million people. The prosecutions did not address the underlying condition. The underlying condition is that millions of Egyptians want to perform a Hajj and cannot obtain permits and cannot afford the official package, and will continue to find unofficial routes because the desire to fulfill religious obligation does not disappear because the official channel is inaccessible. The Egyptian government also raised a Hajj saving scheme, a formal program through which Egyptians can save toward the official Hajj package over multiple years. The scheme had existed before 2024. After 2024, it received more funding and more publicity. Whether it reaches the people who currently cannot access the official system is a question of implementation that will be answered over years, not months. Now the rules. And these rules require a specific framing because the context of the Hajj is unlike any other situation in this series. Every previous episode has ended with rules that assume the person listening has the option to not be in the danger situation, to carry more water, to go home, to call for help, to not hike in Death Valley in July. The Hajj is different. The obligation is theological. The timing is fixed by the lunar calendar. The location is non-negotiable. For 1.8 million Muslims performing the pilgrimage, the option of not being in Mecca in June is not an option in a way that not hiking in Death Valley in July is an option. The rules for surviving the Hajj in extreme heat are therefore rules for managing danger that cannot be avoided, not rules for avoiding it. Rule 1. Your age and your conditions are not the same as your grandfather's age and conditions. The Hajj has been performed for over 1,400 years. For most of that history, it was performed by people traveling on foot or by camel over weeks or months, arriving already hardened by the journey. The pilgrimage itself, physically, was not dramatically more demanding than the travel that preceded it. The modern Hajj is performed by people who fly from air-conditioned homes to air-conditioned airports to air-conditioned hotels, and then step into 51-degree heat to walk 11 kilometers. The physiological transition from controlled climate to extreme outdoor heat is abrupt, and the body is not acclimated. Acclimatization, the process by which the body adjusts to sustained heat exposure, increasing sweat rate, improving cardiovascular efficiency in the heat, reducing salt loss, takes between 7 and 14 days of regular heat exposure. Most pilgrims arrive in Mecca 3 to 5 days before the peak ritual days. They are performing the most physically demanding rituals of the pilgrimage before their bodies have had time to adjust to the climate. If you are planning to perform a Hajj and you have the ability to plan, if you have weeks before departure, begin heat exposure in the weeks before you travel. Walk outdoors during the hottest part of the day in your home climate. Exercise in heat. Let the body begin the acclimatization process before you arrive. This is not comfortable. It is the difference between arriving in Mecca with a body that has begun to adapt and arriving with a body that is encountering sustained extreme heat for the first time. For elderly pilgrims with cardiac or respiratory conditions, the profile that describes the majority of those who died in 2024 discuss the heat exposure with physicians specifically, not whether you are healthy enough to travel, whether you are healthy enough to stand on an open plain in 51-degree heat for 6 hours. These are different questions. Rule 2. Water is not enough. Electrolytes are the variable. The pilgrims who collapsed and died in 2024 were, in many cases, drinking water. The water distribution system, both official and informal networks of volunteers, was providing water. People were drinking it. They were still dying. The reason is sodium. When the body sweats in extreme heat, it loses not just water but electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium, that are essential for the electrical function of the heart muscle and the neurological function of the brain. Replacing water without replacing electrolytes creates a condition called hyponatremia, dangerously low sodium, which in extreme cases produces symptoms indistinguishable from heat stroke and which can be made worse by drinking large amounts of plain water. In the conditions of the Hajj, sustained sweating over multiple days, large volumes of water consumed, limited food intake in many pilgrims who are fasting or eating minimally in the spiritual focus of the pilgrimage, electrolyte depletion is a significant variable. Oral rehydration salts, sports drinks with electrolytes, or electrolyte tablets dissolved in water address this variable. Plain water does not. Carry electrolytes. Use them. Do not rely on water alone when you've been sweating continuously for hours in 50-degree heat. Rule 3. Know the difference between the heat you feel and the heat that is killing you. This rule appears in different forms in every episode of this series because the underlying physiology is the same in every context. But it applies with particular force in the Hajj because the spiritual intensity of the pilgrimage creates a specific psychological condition that works against self-monitoring. Pilgrims describe the Hajj as an experience that transcends the physical, that the spiritual significance of being in the holy places, performing the rituals, being part of the vast community of the faithful, creates a state in which physical discomfort recedes or is consciously subordinated to the spiritual experience. This is not a pathology. It is the point of the pilgrimage. It is what people come for. It is also, in 51-degree heat, a mechanism that delays the recognition of dangerous symptoms. Hassan did not tell anyone about his symptoms for 20 minutes because he did not want to interrupt the experience with physical complaint. This is the instinct of a man engaged in something he has waited 22 years for, and it is understandable, and it almost killed him. The practical rule is to establish a monitoring system that does not depend on self-report. Agree with the people in your group before you arrive, not during the rituals, before that you will check on each other at regular intervals. Not ask how everyone is feeling. Look at each other. Specifically look for confusion or unusual quietness, skin that is flushed and dry rather than sweating, unsteady movement, eyes that are present but not quite focused. These signs in another person are more reliable than that person's self-assessment because the symptom that makes the assessment unreliable is a symptom you are looking for. The young man in Hassan's group who noticed that Hassan was not responding normally to conversation was not trained in medicine. He was paying attention in the way that people in a group can pay attention to each other if they have agreed in advance that paying attention is part of the responsibility of traveling together. That attention, informal, unmedical, simply present, is what saved Hassan's life, not the field hospital, which also saved his life. The field hospital had 11 minutes to work with because the young man noticed 20 minutes into the deterioration rather than an hour in. The earlier the notice, the more the field hospital can do. The question that runs underneath this entire episode, and that deserves a direct answer, is this: is there a version of the Hajj performed in June that does not kill people? The honest answer, based on the available evidence, is probably not at the current scale. 1.8 million people, many of them elderly, many of them arriving unacclimated, many of them moving outside the official support infrastructure, performing mandatory outdoor rituals in 51-degree heat over 5 days. This combination produces deaths. Better infrastructure reduces the number. Better enforcement of the permit system reduces the number. Better medical preparation reduces the number. The combination of better everything reduces the number significantly. It does not reduce it to zero. The physics of the human body in 51-degree heat does not yield to infrastructure and organization completely. There is a residual toll that follows from the irreducible facts of the situation: the temperature, the scale, the physical demands of the rituals, the age and health profile of the pilgrims who come from across the world to fulfill an obligation they have carried for decades. The Saudi government is aware of this. The scholars who advise on Hajj policy are aware of this. The Muslim scholars who study the intersection of Islamic jurisprudence and modern public health are aware of this, and some of them have written about it with considerable nuance, about the obligation of the individual to protect their own life as a religious duty that exists in tension with the obligation to perform the pilgrimage, and about how that tension should be resolved for elderly or medically vulnerable pilgrims considering the Hajj in summer months. These are theological questions that are not settled. They are being discussed in mosques and seminaries and academic journals. They will continue to be discussed for the 16 years until the calendar moves the Hajj out of summer. What is settled is the physiology. What is settled is that 51 degrees is 51 degrees regardless of the spiritual significance of the ground you are standing on. What is settled is that the body does not receive a dispensation from the laws of thermodynamics because the heat is happening in a holy place. Hassan knew this when he flew home. He had performed the Hajj. His heart had been monitored for 4 days in a Saudi hospital. He had seen, in the field hospital and in the faces of the medical personnel and in the conversations of the other patients around him, the weight of what the heat had done that week. He told his daughters it was the most important thing he had ever done. He also told them, and this part he said quietly, not as a complaint, not as a warning, just as a fact that he wanted them to have, that the heat on the plain of Arafat was unlike anything he had experienced in 66 years of life in a hot country, that it was not the heat he had expected, that it was a different category of thing. His daughters listened. They are in their 30s and 40s. They have their own Hajj ahead of them, in years they have not yet determined. When the money is available and the permit is drawn and the time is right, they will go in a different month, if they can. If they cannot, they will carry electrolytes and agree in advance to watch each other and act on the signal before confusion arrives. That is what their father told them. This is heat limit. In June 2024, between 1,301 and 2,000 people died performing one of the most sacred acts of their faith. They died because faith in geography and climate converge in a combination that human planning has not yet found a way to fully manage. The planning gets better every year. The heat gets worse every year. Which of those two trajectories wins the next 16 years is the question that will determine how many people die on the plain of Arafat between now and 2040. Next episode, Karachi, June 2015. A city of 15 million people. Power grid failure. 45 degrees Celsius. No electricity. No water pumps. No cooling. And the question of what happens to a megacity when the infrastructure that keeps it alive stops working in the heat. Subscribe. This information is free. The heat is not going anywhere.